Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Scott Dill with the Real Story Group here to welcome you to today's webinar on Billionaire Behemoths. We're going to be taking a look at Acquia, Exuberance, Sitecore, WordPress, and a changing web content management marketplace. Our founder and lead WCM analyst, Tony Byrne, will be joining us momentarily to take us through the heart of today's presentation. But as we get started, I did want to go over a couple housekeeping items of note real quick. First, we will have time for questions at the end of today's session, so if you do have those, please feel free to enter those into the questions tab and the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. Also, I do want to mention that our subscribers on the line, we certainly appreciate your business, and you'll have access to a recording of this presentation in your subscriber library. And for all those that are attending today, also want to let you know that you will be able to access the slides within the next couple of days. So our marketing team will get those over to you. So keep an eye out for that. And certainly wanted to thank you very much for your time today. It's much appreciated. I know you certainly have busy schedules, so to take a half hour does not go unnoticed, and we are certainly grateful for that. And today, what we're going to do in terms of our focus is take a look at some of the bigger players on the blue line here in our Omnichannel stack vendor map, which is web content and experience management. When you think of Real Story Group, we actually got our start covering the web content management marketplace, and since then we've added a number of these other sub-lines, as we call them, such as digital asset management and customer data platforms, and our soon-to-be released research on omni-channel content platforms. But at our core is certainly taking a look at the WCM marketplace, and so that's what we're going to be going ahead and doing today. So Tony's going to tell you a little bit more about Real Story Group and how we got started, and I'll be back at the end of the presentation to wrap things up. So Tony, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I founded Real Story Group originally as CMS Watch, and so web content management has always been near and dear to my heart, and I've been either implementing or analyzing these tools for a bit more than 2 decades now. So it's been really fascinating watching this space grow. I think from an original 12 vendors we covered now up to about 3 dozen. A lot of interesting things happening in the past couple of years, so we'll talk about that. But first, I wanted to just explain a little bit how, why the presentation you're going to get today might be a little bit different from other analyst firms. We have always tried to focus more on vendor fit rather than is one vendor generically better in some top right-hand quadrant than another. We typically cover quite a few vendors in each marketplace, not a limited set of vendors. We cover open source tools, for example. And we decided from the very beginning that if we were going to tell you the real story about these tools, we had to be completely independent. So as far as we know, we're the only major analyst firm in the world that's completely on the buy side, which means we don't advise vendors, we don't speak at their events, we don't accept a cup of coffee for them, we don't write white papers, we don't let them quote us in their press releases. And this way, you know that what you're getting from us is the real story, that all we really care about is you, the actual customer, getting you not just the strengths about these different tools and platforms and vendors, but also a really candid look at their significant weaknesses and what it would be like to actually implement those solutions. So, WCM, definitely some behemoths emerging, but let's look at it in the context of some current, marketplace. So, here's the WCM marketplace circa Q4 of this year. We find that the best way to do this in a 2-dimensional kind of grouping is on a complexity spectrum. So roughly speaking, from left to right are the more complex tools on the left, less complex tools on the right. This isn't a value judgment, with one exception here I'm going to get into in a minute. Sometimes you may want more native richness and customizability and extensibility, so you're going to look more to the left. Other times you may want to have less complexity, less developer intensity, less developer focus, and certainly lower cost. You're going to look maybe a little bit more to the right. Certainly in the middle of this space is a very interesting sweet spot in sort of the mid-range. But obviously a lot of investment and activity happening across the board here. Certainly the 4 unicorns we're going to talk about today, Sitecore, Acquia, Exuberance, and WordPress, kind of span this spectrum as well. So, it's a really interesting marketplace, a lot going on in this space. It is an exceptionally wide marketplace. There's a lot of tools here, as you can see. There is a collection in the lower left of what we call legacy vendors. And so that's, Microsoft, the former IBM product, Oracle, and OpenText. Oracle and OpenText still kind of making a go at it, but we still tend to think of these as tools that you leave rather than you license. And so what that means is that with the possible exception of Adobe, the major software vendors that you might think about are pretty AWOL in this space. And of course, that also includes SAP and Salesforce. So what's happened is you have this whole set of kind of tier 2 vendors, many of which now are in sort of past billion-dollar valuations, which is really interesting. Having said all that, there's also very healthy, mostly commercial open source, but certainly very healthy open source communities thriving as well. Acquia and WordPress being 2 examples of those, but certainly very many others as well. And Braco, worth a note, Easy still around, Clone still around, so forth. And so that also kind of rounds out this picture. One of the things that we have seen as a trend, and I think this has helped drive some of the valuations of some of these vendors, is that the channel partner strategy has really proven to be something of a winner. In other words, being able to not just do all the implementations yourself as a software vendor, the way you tend to see, for example, in software as a service, but rather really understanding the complexity and the variations and certainly the integration needs that come to the fore these days with a web content management system, that a customer needs the vendor, but they also need a channel partner very often as well. And so vendors that go to market through channel partners have tended to focus better and, quite frankly, tended to grow faster. So that leads us to the rise of the WCM unicorns, and this really has been going on for a while. Noteworthy here was Sitecore getting acquired by private equity in April of 2016 at a valuation of $1 billion. This kind of woke up the marketplace, and particularly interesting because it was Sitecore who kind of helped innovate the phrase digital experience platform, and they were going to be much more than a WCM vendor, but actually put together a collection of things under a single kind of rubric or suite to try to do more than just manage your website. The other thing that has happened, and we saw this then with Exuberance in 2018, also getting valued at $1 billion, also bought by an equity firm. Exuberance also, along with Sitecore, somewhat belatedly introducing platform as a service. So you see this whole transition from not just being a WCM technology provider, but also these vendors seeking new revenue streams by providing essentially managed cloud hosting. And this has turned out to be a very lucrative business, along with converting their software licensing from a perpetual to a subscription model. This has been gold to investors' ears because, first of all, they love subscription models, and this has proven to be much more profitable for vendors, which is another way of saying that they're charging you a lot more than they used to. And secondly, it leads to more lock-in, and investors love lock-in. Those of us who are advisors to you, the customer, we don't tend to like lock-in. And so you'll see in our research, we counsel you against steps that you want to do to mitigate against that. But clearly that was driving some valuations as well. More recently, in September, Automatic raised $300 million at a whopping $3 billion valuation. So Automatic, very interesting company, probably the leading commercial enterprise around WordPress, but not the only one. So that's kind of interesting as well, because the WordPress is so huge an ecosystem that spans such a wide variety of customers that it really supports a whole plethora of commercial enterprises. But Automatic being the largest and arguably the one with the most influence on the direction of the product, getting valued at $3 billion. And then finally, just a few short weeks ago, Acquia getting acquired by a private equity firm for $1 billion as well. Acquia, of course, being the main commercial driver behind Drupal, really kind of skimming off the most highest end Drupal implementations, but also itself presenting itself as not just a Drupal platform as a service, which may even be getting kind of commoditized, but really trying to replay itself as a DXP. So Acquia itself now has either acquired or resells a variety of other tools like e-commerce, marketing automation, journey orchestration, digital asset management. And so they've thrown these things together and called themselves a DXP. And obviously that has commanded the attention of investors as well. So what's going on here? I think that part of what's happening here is the whole changing context for WCM. And I think this whole kind of DXP revolution is really something that is a logical extension of what was happening really in the last decade, which brought not just cloud, but I think a more greater sort of digital sophistication. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about the evolution of web content management marketplace in three parts. And so we're not going to go into deep history here, but I've been following this for leading into 3 decades here, and I think that there's something to share here. So first, let's talk about the 2000s, where I think a lot of us were looking at our web content management systems, or sometimes called CMS platforms, then as really the center of our digital ecosystem, that things fed into it and then it spit stuff out. And so it may even be, we didn't say multi-channel, but certainly multi-format or multi-device. And this was sort of the mixing bowl where we built our websites and in many cases web applications as well. So this was kind of a reference model for the 2000s, with WCM sort of at the center of your digital ecosystem. Then in the 2010s, I think, we started thinking about digital engagement a little bit more broadly, and seeing that, first of all, customer data needed to feed into some of this, that you had digital asset management, media asset management feeding into your web content management system. You also, of course, saw the rise of marketing automation and email service providers, and clearly social engagement took off during this decade, and then having to drive through a variety of production, interaction, delivery services across multiple channels. So WCM is really essential here. If you look at all of these green arrows up at the top, WCM platforms really trying to drive a number of different channels, but clearly having to work with a number of other parallel systems to be able to deliver an increasing diversity of digital experiences. And so the vendors responded basically with this notion of a DXP, right? That if I'm a Sitecore or an Acquia or an Episerver, I'm going to build in these sorts of capabilities, or I'm going to acquire other companies, or I'm going to resell other solutions and white label them to try to give you the impression that I can do all of this sort of stuff for you. Now, we'll get to this in a minute. The reality is that's something of a charade, that they actually can't do all this stuff effectively for you. But that's the general idea behind the rise of the DXP, and clearly that was an attractive formulation for vendors who were looking for, larger firms with more tools to sell in their quiver, and then that driving a lot of investment in this space and the rise of these new unicorns. But what's interesting is what I'm going to call evolution part 3. And so this is really a stack not for the 2010s, but for the 2020s. And so this is Real Story Group's Omnichannel CX reference model. And what's interesting here is that you see WCM still here in the green. There's a number of other capabilities we have to be thinking about, including, of course, CRM and services and support across all these different engagement channels. Now we're seeing the rise of these different enterprise foundation services that live underneath your systems. So these would be operations hubs where you're getting project management and collaboration, journey orchestration, decisioning, which is where the future of omni-channel personalization is going to reside. Certainly customer data platforms, which we have a lot of really good research on, where you keep your definitive customer data rather than having it stuck in your WCM silo. You make it available to all of your different channels. And then this thing that we're calling an omni-channel content platform or content hub, we're releasing some new research around that. It's kind of a content object store for base stories and components that you're going to use in an omnichannel context. And so that is nominally a platform that even lives underneath your web content management system and kind of at some level may obviate the need for multi-channel capabilities within your WCM. So what we're seeing is the scope of WCM narrowing substantially. And that's not a good or a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's what's happening. And so a lot of the larger vendors are really kind of struggling around this. Like, can we tell a story around this? There are 36 other vendors. How do we differentiate ourselves? And I think that, you know, where vendors have tried to differentiate themselves is around complexity, but then also trying to sell all of these other services under, I think, the myth that it's going to be more integrated if you buy them all from them. So that has driven the rise of this notion of a DXP, which along with cloud-based hosting has driven new sorts of revenue models. And that's what's, I think, created these sorts of unicorns. So again, this omnichannel means moving key services lower in your stack. We sometimes call this Pilates for your stack. And what this means is that you still do need your web content management system to do this sort of channel-specific contextualization, assembly, delivery, and some level of interaction. But it doesn't have to be as smart or as capable as it used to be. So we see the WCM, the scope of it really becoming thinner and less complex in the 2020s. So another way of putting this is that I think that these billion-dollar valuations are reaching a kind of a peak in this whole cycle, that they represent WCM kind of this, and WCM and this notion of an integrated DXP kind of at its apex. And I think that it's likely to be declining going forward, which again isn't a good or a bad thing. It just is. I think actually we'll see in a minute, it's probably a good thing for you, the customer. So when Gartner and Forrester tell you that digital experience platforms are actually something that exists, I would argue that they're actually doubling down on the 2010s. So this is a 2010 concept that really doesn't have legs. This whole idea that, you know, a single vendor, you should look at them because they have personalization and they have e-commerce and they have DAM and they have WCM, many of which have been acquired or are OEMs of something else. The fact that these quadrants have Oracle and IBM in the leadership quadrants or circles as well also is suggestive that this is really a whole concept that's really completely outdated and in fact completely artificial. There is no such thing as a DXP. There are vendors who try to sell multiple tools, but there's no such thing as a DXP. Another way of putting this is that I might imagine that some of the investment firms that have given these some of these vendors really high valuations may be in for a surprise going forward. And in fact, I think what we're going to see here is what we're starting to call a kind of a great pause, where as an industry and certainly among you, the customers, people are asking themselves, what's the level of investments I should be making in something like a WCM platform? And maybe since it's no longer the 2000s where it's my whole digital world, and it's not the 2010s where it's like maybe the center of my digital stack, in 2020s it's just kind of part of my digital stack. What's the level of investment that I should really be making? So once again, I'll remind you that we're going to have time for questions here in about 5 minutes or so. So if you have any questions at all or something you disagree with or some examples you want to share, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. So this great pause, I think, is really around savvy buyers are trying to right-size their WCM investment relative to other digital needs, that maybe this isn't the center of where they should be doing all their campaigns at a time when they're talking to customers more through CRM, more through contact centers, more through chat areas, more through, certainly through outbound marketing automation, whether it's email, text, what have you. And the other thing that's happening is greater attention being driven to marketing, you know, being given to marketing attribution. And that's driving closer scrutiny of cost, particularly, especially to inbound marketing in general, and, you know, complicated personalization schemes in particular. That's really driving the value of what we want. And the third thing that's happened that's been really fascinating to watch is that if we look at these mid-market WCM vendors, they can now do 80% or more of what the upper tier vendors can do. To be sure, maybe lacking some richness here and there, some extensibility, but you can get many of the advanced capabilities that you might need, including cloud deployment, really sophisticated configuration management, advanced personalization, content variation, potential for multi-channel delivery, you can get that in the mid-market now. And so there's less and less for the upper tier to differentiate themselves against. And, so just an example here, we'll talk about Sitecore in this context. I mean, Sitecore is trying to sell all of these different services within a single environment, and yet it's a high-end system. So that seems a little bit of a paradox to me, because typically larger enterprises want to do more best of breed and have proper separations of concerns. I think the other question about Sitecore, so that's on the left, on the right is, has this thing simply gotten too big and too complicated for its own good? To be sure, you can do anything you want with a Sitecore implementation if you have enough time, money, and ibuprofen. But if you want to do something simpler, then this kind of architecture gets in your way. And so I think there's a reconsideration that's going on, not just with Sitecore, but to some extent even Episerver, which has tried to mimic Sitecore's strategy and technology. Is it really too much for this coming decade? And as you may know, Sitecore recently had some layoffs, about 5% of its staff. We blogged about that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in financial trouble. In fact, it may have been a wise move from a business perspective, but I think maybe emblematic of kind of this pause that's happening. And then the second thing is really around Acquia as well. I mean, here's the Acquia founder and Drupal original creator, Dries, his sort of evolution over the years from being the guy who created this in his almost in his dorm room in the Netherlands, then joining Acquia and getting investment funding, and then now, although he's still with Acquia, I think likely to get some sort of payout and move on to a different phase. And this has been the growth of Acquia really kind of taking the top of the Drupal marketplace by finding the most typically the most reputation sensitive or complex Drupal implementations and providing hosting, and now a whole value of add-on services. And so I'm not sure the extent to which that's totally scalable. There's a lot of competition there. There's certainly a lot of really good Drupal hosting you can get elsewhere. And so they're kind of converting themselves from being a hosting play into, again, a DXP, where you have this content management system that nominally then feeds this broader marketing hub. And, you can mark us down for being pretty substantial skeptics around this whole approach, that at the high end of the marketplace, I want to put all of my marbles into this single basket, particularly because this basket isn't necessarily better integrated than any others. So I think what this does too is give you the opportunity to think about, potentially thinking about simpler solutions. And there's a lot here that we haven't necessarily put there. These are just more representative and exemplary. So if you're looking at one of these high-end systems, you can maybe feel some assurance that, hey, they're a unicorn. These are billion-dollar companies now. But I think if you think about, I encourage you to sort of join the great pause and ask yourself, hey, is this really what I want here for the 2020s? Maybe I should be going with a simpler solution. And that is, to some extent, I think the magic of WordPress. I'm not suggesting that WordPress is always going to be a good solution for you. In fact, if you see our research, you'll see that WordPress has some significant shortcomings, particularly around personalization, particularly around the integration model, and other issues. So it's not a good fit for everybody necessarily. It's a mid-market to low mid-market solution. But having said that, I think that being part of this sort of growing mid-market, I think probably gives Automatic a somewhat rosier future, and I think I do understand the $3 billion valuation there. So let's wrap up some takeaways, and then we'll get to your questions, and I'll remind you there's still some time for questions. So, these unicorns, kudos to them. They've been successful. The early founders have cashed out or are cashing out, but you really want to, rather than buy according to how investors are putting into these platforms, really find the right size and the right fit for you. So all these solutions have problems, including WordPress. You've got to really find the one that, again, is going to be the right mix and match for you. WCM tools have been growing in complexity. We've been watching this over 2 decades, but especially in the last decade. And that has brought a lot of richness to the platforms, which as customers we've asked for and as integration partners we've wanted. But This is potentially a dark alley in an emerging omnichannel world where you're going to ask your web content management platform to be less of a decision maker and more of an order taker. And the third thing is, don't default to your web content management platform as an omnichannel content platform. There's a variety of different reasons for this. Most of them are not particularly well suited. We are seeing the rise of a whole separate breed of omnichannel content platforms, some of which have emerged from the WCM market, some from content marketing, some from DAM. These are tools that really are more channel agnostic than a WCM platform is going to be. That's the new red line on our map. We're going to be releasing research around this next week. We're going to be having a webinar about this in a couple of weeks, and I encourage you to check in if you're really thinking about omnichannel content, to focus less on your web content management system, which we believe in most cases is going to be too parochial, and instead really focusing on omnichannel content. So with that, I once again invite you to check out our web content experience management. You won't find any harder hitting research out there in the marketplace. If you are a stack owner, we call this Stacy the Stack Owner, and you've got questions, feel free to reach out to us. We live and breathe to make Stacy's life easier. And so the whole purpose of our research is to answer the questions that people bombard Stacy, the CX Stack Owner, with. And our mission in life is to be a resource and make her more successful. So if you are Stacy or you know Stacy, feel free to reach out to us. There's various ways you can subscribe to our research. One is to just pick a marketplace like WCM, subscribe to our research, get the inside dope on what's wrong and what's right with the vendors, and have some advisory time with us. Or you can do an all-you-can-eat where you subscribe to all of our research, and then we help you with some stack decisions. And then a subset of those individuals are invited to join our exclusive confidential leadership council for omnichannel stack owners. We've just had our first meeting, second one scheduled for February. We're really excited about that. Scott, if you want to just talk about next steps, and then we're going to get to some questions here.
Yeah, just to dovetail off what Tony was saying, if you haven't seen our decision tools in action that help you narrow down the vendors we cover into a short list that best meets your needs, drop us a line at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'd be happy to take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of the subscriber experience. You're also welcome to download excerpts from the web content management research and any other topics we cover, so please feel free to do that. As Tony mentioned, we'll be having our next webinar around our latest research on omnichannel content platforms. That'll be taking place on November 12th, so hopefully you can join us for that. And it does look as though there are a couple questions in, Tony.
Yeah, so a couple people have asked about recordings. If you're a Real Story Group subscriber, you'll get access to the full recording. Everyone else will get a copy of the deck within the next day or two. Maggie is asking, I know this about WCM, but do you have any recommendations for content management for printing or packaging? It doesn't need to be as complex as Sitecore, for instance. So Maggie, we address this more in our digital asset management research, where that's one of the use cases, is integration with printing and packaging systems. That's typically seen as something that falls under the rubric of digital asset management, or sometimes product information management, or PIM, that then integrate with packaging and printing systems around this. So it tends not to be more of a WCM function. And then Jeffrey's asking, does the Salesforce investment in WordPress means that they're jumping into the WCM market? I don't think so. I think Salesforce invests in a lot of interesting companies, and it doesn't necessarily presage any kind of an acquisition. Salesforce will sometimes invest in companies that are even almost competing with some of their portfolios and some of the acquisitions that they've made. Salesforce at times has dallied, in fact, had a WCM product for a while that they claimed they were committed to and then dropped after a couple of iterations. So it goes to show you that big vendors will sometimes drop products at the drop of a hat. I think that, Jeffrey, that Salesforce may make an acquisition in this space at some point, but just the fact, again, that the scope of this is narrowing may make it less attractive for them to jump in the pool. They may be quite satisfied with just partnering with WCM vendors rather than adding their own service. So Bradley's asking, what do you recommend to a buyer looking for omnichannel, given this myth of omnichannel vendors? Put together best of breed solutions. So, this is a classic question, Bradley, and we tend to think about this in terms of the size and complexity of your organization. So if you're a larger enterprise, then you probably do want to be thinking more best of breed. And the reason for this is that you don't want to just ever default to a solution because it came from the same vendor. You can't assume that it's well integrated. And what's more, if we're talking about fit here, you can't guarantee that it's going to be the right fit for you. So just because you use Adobe AEM for web content management doesn't mean you should get Adobe AEM for digital asset management, because there's a variety of reasons why it may be a poor fit for you. So yeah, look at your incumbent vendors, but you really want to make sure that the things that are really important for you, that you're getting the right fit solution. And integration is going to be hard either way, So you're going to be investing in integration whether you get a tool from the same vendor or whether you get tools from different vendors. So again, it depends more on the size of your enterprise. Great. So with that, again, we want to thank you for participating. For Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne from Real Story Group. Looking forward to seeing you again. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.